Dr. Elaine Ingham and the Soil Food Web School promote a number of ideas that are very controversial. In this program, I'd like to have a look at some of those ideas. So what is the food soil web? Well, every organism in soil, including microbes and bacteria and worms and everything that's living there, and including plants, need to have a food source. Each of these organisms are eating each other, and the drawing of the soil food web shows the interaction of these organisms. How is the food moving from one place to another? A lot of this movement starts with plants. They produce the food from the sun, and then organisms eat the plants, and the larger organisms eat smaller ones, and they get eaten by even larger ones. Through that process, the nutrients and energy is transferred through various organisms throughout the soil system. That's the soil food web. Now, the real reason why everything is trying to find food is to get an energy source. The energy is key to this. That's why in my book, Soil Science for Gardeners, I modified the diagram a little bit to do two things. One is I focused it more on the energy side of things. And two, I also included the things that are happening above the soil. The soil isn't an isolated system that's working on its own. So plants are taking energy from the sun, turning that into carbohydrates and sugars, and those are the main food source for all the other organisms that are on our planet. Any energy that's not used ends up in the organic matter in soil. That organic matter, which contains energy, is now the food source for a whole new group of organisms, most of which are microbes. And a lot of that happens in the soil. But it also happens above ground. When you see some dead wood laying on the ground and you see mushrooms growing on it, they're using up that dead organic matter. The ideas for the soil food web were developed in the 1920s, and we've been doing research on this system for about 35 years. Now, even though that seems like a long time, we actually don't understand most of these interactions. Science is still just starting to get a glimpse into what is really happening. But the fundamental principles that I've discussed so far are true, and science does accept those. So what is the Food Soil Web School? It's an educational business whose focus is on educating people how to build healthy soil. It was started by Dr. Elaine Ingham, who's a microbiologist and healthy soil advocate. The school was formed in the 2000s, and their focus is on teaching people how to improve the soil in their garden. They teach the fundamental principles of the biology that's going on in soil, and they educate people on how they can improve the soil, how to make it healthier. Compost and compost tea are major components of this process. The other part that's really important is the understanding of the microbes. What are they, and do you have the right kind? How do you identify the microbes that you do have? And then how do you go about improving that whole process? Although many of the concepts that they teach in the school are valid and are based on basic principles that we know about soil, the school also teaches controversial topics. And in this program, I'd like to have a look at some of those topics. This includes the fact that soils can be regenerated very quickly, that compost tea plays an important role in making healthy soil, that you can use a microscope to identify and quantitate soil microbes, the importance of the fungal to bacteria ratio, the FB ratio. And finally, I'd like to have a look at weed control and their suggestion that you can use the FB ratio to control the weeds in your garden. Are these concepts valid, and should you be using them in your garden? The first topic I'd like to have a look at is this idea that you can regenerate soil quickly. Under the soil food web approach, it's claimed that only with the complete soil food web in place can the ecological functions of the soil be restored, protecting and purifying the world's waterways, reversing climate change, and providing super nutritional foods. Using biocomplete soil amendments, Most soils can be regenerated in the first growing season. Those are some pretty lofty claims. Imagine that in one season, you can regenerate your degraded soil and solve climate change. But of course, you do have to take the course to learn how to do that. What is the biocomplete soil amendment? Well, this is how they define it. The minimum requirements for a biocomplete compost include bacterial biomass of 135 milligrams per gram of compost, mushroom biomass, 135 milligrams per gram of compost. Now, I assume by mushroom biomass, they're actually referring to fungal biomass here. The SB ratio is equal to or greater than 0.03. Now, I think that's a typo. I think they actually mean the FB ratio. Protozoa with a quantity of 10,000 per gram. Useful nematodes, 100 per gram. And note the reference to the useful nematodes. And ciliates, well, we want less than 5 per drop. Now, the school normally emphasizes the importance of getting the right kind of microbes in your soil. But if you notice from this list, we're not actually trying to identify them. I mean, any bacteria will do, even if it's a pathogen, provided you get enough quantity of bacteria. That seems a bit odd to me. One thing we do know about soil, it doesn't change very quickly. No matter how good that compost is, no matter how perfect it is, you're not going to regenerate soil in one season. That's quite a ridiculous claim. Let's go on and have a look at the next claim, that you can use a microscope to identify microbes. Now, this is a critical component of what the school teaches you. They actually have a course to show you how to use a microscope to identify those microbes in your soil and compost. That's important because they have an emphasis on making sure that you have the right kind of microbes in your soil. And of course, the right quantity. Now, a microscope can be used to identify the type of organism. So you can usually see the difference between a bacteria, which looks like a small spot, and a fungal hyphae, which is more like a long hair. You can also identify some other organisms like nematodes and protozoa. But trying to identify these past that type level is really hard with a microscope, even if you're a professional. Consider this. Scientists have been studying the microbes in soil for quite a while, and they estimate that we know something about maybe 20% of the organisms that live there. The other 80%, and we're not even sure that that's the right number, haven't been identified at all. So the specialists, the scientists looking at this admit that 80% of them haven't been identified. And yet gardeners and farmers are going to be asked to use a microscope after a short course and identify them all. I have discussed a number of the limitations of microscopy on my website, gardenmess.com, and you can go and have a look at more detailed discussion there. But here's a simple test that you can do for yourself. Go to the internet and find yourself a picture of a soil fungi. It'll look like a bunch of strands of hair. Now, assuming you've taken the course, this is now your task. Determine if the fungi you're looking at is alive. After all, there's no point in having a whole bunch of dead microbes in your soil. That's not going to help you. Determine the mass of the fungi on a per gram of sample basis. On a microscope, you can see volume, but you really can't determine mass. Now determine if the fungi is beneficial or not. Good luck with that assignment. Now, is it important to identify microbes past the type level? And by type, we mean, is it a bacteria or a fungi? Well, according to the Soil Food Web School, it is. You have to have the right kind of microbes in your soil and in your compost tea. Otherwise, they won't work. You also have to know whether these organisms are beneficial or not. We want more of the beneficial types and less of the pathogen. And the way you figure all this out is with microscopy. The problem is that microscopy won't give you those answers. Now let's have a look at compost tea. Compost tea is a fundamental requirement of the school. Compost tea is going to be used all over the place to improve the soil, and making it is a big part of the teachings of the school. Now we know compost tea contains nutrients, and we know that if we put nutrients on soil, plants grow better. And so do microbes, because microbes and plants both need the same kind of nutrient. Proponents of compost tea, and that includes the Soil Food Web School, claim that the big contribution of compost tea are the microbes in it, not just the nutrients. They want to grow microbes and then spread those around. Now, as far as soil goes, compost tea does very little to change the microbes in soil. The amount you're adding from the compost tea is really, really tiny compared to the billions and billions of microbes already in your soil. A simple speck of soil in the palm of your hand contains 1 billion microbes. And now we take compost tea, which might have a couple hundred, and we add that to that soil. It's not going to make much difference. What the science has shown is that the quantity of microbes does not really increase when we add compost tea to it. There may be a 1% change in the biome, the makeup of the species in that soil. But science doesn't yet know whether that's actually beneficial or detrimental. If we start changing the species that are living in our soil, is that really an improvement? Now, we don't know that yet. There is also some evidence that putting microbes on plants, either on the leaves or right at the roots, may prevent certain diseases. But almost all the research here looks at a very specific microbe that is then grown in concentrated form and applied to the plant. So they take a specific microbe and treat a specific disease, and in some cases they can see improvement. What scientists don't do is brew up a batch of microbes based on compost where they have no idea what's in that material, and then spray that around the garden and hope they cure a disease. There's virtually no evidence that that works. Now, you might get lucky and find the right organism and the right disease, but there's really no support for doing that on a general basis. The use of compost tea in the garden does not have scientific support. In fact, what has been shown is that using compost by itself is even more effective than using the tea. All right, what about the fungal to bacterial ratio? I'll give you a little background on this. So if we look in soil, two of the main groups of microbes are bacteria and fungi. And what scientists found was that the ratio of these two, the relative amount of these two, changes depending on what soil they're looking at. And so now scientists are trying to understand this ratio and why it's important and what does it really mean. Dr. Ingham and the school are strong proponents of the idea that you need to get the ratio correct for the type of plants you're going to grow. Get the ratio right and the plants grow well. As it turns out, woody plants like very high fungal ratios, and they grow better there. The grasses and the herbaceous plants and most of the vegetables you grow, well, they prefer a lower ratio. They like more bacteria than the fungi. Now, the first time I heard this, I couldn't help but visualize a city park. You know, an area that has lots of grass and these old majestic trees growing in it. Both the trees and the grass, they're both growing well. Well, how can that be if each of those plants wants a different FB ratio? That didn't make any sense to me. So that's why I started researching this topic. It turns out that soil does have quite a range of FB ratios. And so scientists have gone out and measured various kinds of soils to understand this better. Coniferous forests tend to have a ratio of about 100 to 1,000. That's a huge amount of fungi compared to bacteria. Now, deciduous forests, they have a ratio of 5 to 100. Weeds and grasslands are 0.1 to 1. And agricultural fields are also 0.1 to 1. Scientists do agree that different soils have different FB ratios. They also agree that as we turn to agriculture and we take land and grow food, the amount of fungi comes down and the number of bacteria go up. And so we have a lower FB ratio. And some people have attributed that to being terrible soil. They equate agriculture as destroying our soil, and since agriculture is creating a low FB ratio, that's got to be bad for soil. Well, not necessarily so. When we add organic matter to soil, it does change this ratio. If we add organic matter that is higher in carbon, has a high CN ratio, so things like woody products, we see an increase in the fungal population. When we add organic matter that has a higher nitrogen level, so a very low carbon level, we tend to see more bacteria grow. Now, scientists agree that the FB ratio might be important, but what they don't agree on is the fact that it determines which plants can grow there. In fact, the current thinking is that it's actually the other way around. It's the plants that are growing there that condition the soil. For example, if we take a field and we now plant trees there, in 100 years from now, those trees will have added a lot of woody products to the soil. That increases the fungal ratio, and you'll have a higher FB ratio. It's the plants that are conditioning the soil, not the other way around. If we take a wooded field and we remove the trees and replace it with grasses and herbaceous plants, they stop adding high carbon organic matter to the soil. And over time, the fungal populations drop and the FB ratio drops. The plants are conditioning the soil. The last topic I'd like to look at is that we can use the FB ratio to control weeds. So the school story goes like this. Because your ratio is wrong, not enough fungal material in there, you're getting lots of weeds. If we now take compost tea and add that to soil to build up the fungal population, weeds will disappear. Weeds don't grow in areas where we have a high FB ratio. So you can control your weeds by controlling your FB ratio. And you do that with compost tea. But you have to make sure you brew the right kind of tea to do that. Consider this scenario. There's a forest fire and it kills all the trees on the side of the hill. What happens? Well, within no time at all, the ground is covered in weeds. Now, we might call those wildflowers, but they're still weeds. There's really no difference between a weed and a wildflower. They're both herbaceous plants, and they grow extremely well after a forest fire. And yet, that soil, because it had trees there, has a high FB ratio. The FB ratio hasn't changed, but suddenly we go from trees to grasses, and they're growing really well there. That's a good example where the FB ratio does not prevent weed growth. Now, some of you have smaller gardens, and I know you've spent a lot of time in making your soil really healthy. You've been adding compost to that soil. You have brown leaves in the fall. They're great for fungal growth. So now you have a nice, rich soil. Do you get weeds? I've never run into a gardener that says, hey, my soil is so healthy and so good, I never see a weed. Also consider this. If you've got this great soil and you don't see weeds anymore, what are you growing in that soil? Well, you're probably growing vegetables. Well, vegetables are just another type of weed. There's no difference between a dandelion and a lettuce. They're both herbaceous plants. You can't tell me that your lettuce loves the soil and your dandelion won't grow there because you have the wrong FB ratio. This idea of controlling weeds by controlling the FB ratio is just nonsense, and there's no support in science for this. Now, Dr. Ingham and the Soil Food Web School do a good job by educating people about soil and microbes and how to improve the soil. Unfortunately, they've become too involved in the regenerative process. It's a methodology that is not very science-based. Much of the material they present is quite valid. The basic information about microbes is quite good. Their understanding of what healthy soil is fairly good. You just have to watch which of their concepts you actually believe in and make sure that what you're believing is actually science-based. Mainstream science does not support the idea of changing your FB ratio. It does not support the idea of using compost tea in the garden. Now, it We'll grow plants because it has nutrients in it, but so does the compost. The actual process of making tea isn't adding much to the process. And this idea of using microscopy, that's not used by most scientists to measure these kinds of things. Microscopy does have a place in science. It's used a lot. But you have to be very careful about what you're measuring under a microscope. Now, if you'd like to learn more about compost tea, have a look at this video right here. And if you want to know how to deal with your weeds, have a look at this one right here. Happy gardening.